How the New York Knicks put themselves back on the map. Let's get into this.
Oh yeah, I work with the medics. I'm about to get you injected. I got a couple connections so I can get you prosthetic.
Quickly before we get the video started, if you guys enjoy this video and want to see more NBA content just like this one, hit that subscribe button and that post notification bell. Anyways, back to the video. After being one of the worst franchises for so long, maybe 20-30 years at this point, over the past few seasons more recently, the New York Knicks were finally starting to build something special. In the past, the Knicks would just try to throw a ton of money at a star player that was getting up there in age, and of course it never worked out for them basically each and every season. But more recently, under a new regime, the Knicks finally started to smarten up and actually build through the draft. Although this is under the old regime, everything really started with the Knicks pushing towards their youth movement in 2015 when they drafted Kristaps Porzingis. At that point in 2015, the Knicks weren't fully all in on their youth movement, but after seeing how good Porzingis was very early on in his rookie season, at that point there was a shift. In 2016 was really the last season where the Knicks were the Knicks of old. At that point, they once again brought in some older NBA stars that they thought they could win an NBA championship with when they brought in Derrick Rose as well as Joakim Noah. Carmelo was already on the team and Porzingis was also on the team at that point. And of course that Knicks team fell short once again, just like their history has shown. But honestly, that was the last season that the Knicks were really the Knicks of old. Ever since then, they changed management and things were really starting to push in the youth movement. Now starting from that 2017 season, that's when they changed their management and really started to push in the youth movement. But although they were starting to push in that direction and drafting younger players and just building around the young core that they already had, it doesn't necessarily mean they were drafting the right players, and they certainly did struggle pretty early. Early on in the first season where they were really pushing in that direction, they drafted Frank Ntilikina with the 8th overall pick, when at the time a lot of people thought that he could honestly be a bust, and of course he has been a bust for the Knicks. And then the season after that, they drafted Kevin Knox, who has been a bust as well, with the 9th overall pick, so certainly it didn't start off too hot for the Knicks. Although the Knicks did have the right idea in terms of going in the youth movement and just building through the draft picks they were actually making with their higher selections were not the right ones, which obviously can hurt your organization going forward, and was a big reason why the Knicks were so bad for even longer than they should have been. But in the 2019 NBA season, things finally started to shift for the Knicks. That season, they drafted RJ Barrett with a 3rd overall selection, and that was finally a good selection for the Knicks. In his rookie season, he had an okay season. A lot of people thought he was a bust early on in his rookie season, but when you actually look at the numbers, they weren't bad numbers. He was averaging around 15 points per game, playing some decent defense, decent offense overall, but it was a rookie season. He was a rookie at that point, and you would expect him to improve from there on. But that season, in his rookie year, the Knicks once again were a pretty bad organization and a pretty bad team, but at that point they were finally moving in the right direction with some of the better younger players they've been drafting and building somewhat of a nice young core at that point. But still at that point, they were nowhere near where they needed to be. But after that 2019 season, during that offseason going into the 2020 NBA season, that's where everything changed for the Knicks. The Knicks finally moved on from some of the people they had in their organization for a very long time and moved on to the new president of basketball operations, which was going to be Leon Rose. Now this was his first time running an organization, and there was a ton of questions if the Knicks actually made the right move by signing him, but pretty early on he made it pretty clear that the Knicks have made the right decision. In Leon's first season, in his first draft class, he actually drafted Obi Toppin with the 8th overall selection, which was definitely seen as a steal at that point. Obi had so much talent in college, and going into the NBA, he was seen as a top 5 talent in that year's draft, but the fact that the Knicks were able to get him with that 8th overall selection was definitely seen as a win. And although in his rookie year he didn't necessarily live up completely to the expectations, towards the tail end of last season and also going into the playoffs, he definitely shined some flashes, and early on in this season he has looked extremely good. But the reason why Obi didn't necessarily live up to expectations or wasn't even getting enough playing time in order to do so was because the season prior, the Knicks actually brought in Julius Randle, and although in his first season with the Knicks he definitely did struggle and didn't live up to expectations either, going into the offseason and going into that 2020 season, he put the most work on his game that he ever has, and it was clear and obvious that he has put in so much work into his game in that 2020 season, where he actually played so much better and won the most improved player award that year. And also in that offseason going into the 2020 season, Leon made some other smaller moves that definitely did help out pretty significantly, bringing in a guy like Reggie Bullock, who's a great 3-and-D guy and would just help these young guys out tremendously, some other guys like Taj Gibson who they brought in. He brought in some nice pieces. Although they weren't huge pieces, they were definitely nice to complement the young players they had on their team. And at the point that the Knicks were currently at, that's exactly what you would want to do. And then all of a sudden you look up at this Knicks roster and they actually had a very nice team at that point. Of course, they had Julius Randle, who was completely breaking out in that 2020 season. Barrett, who was having a breakout season of his own from his rookie year to his second season. Mitchell Robinson has always been pretty good throughout his whole career. You got a nice young talent in Obi Toppin, which you'll see what happens going forward for him. Emmanuel Quickly, who you got later on in that same year's draft, was looking amazing coming off the bench for you. You brought in a guy in Alec Burks during that offseason as well, just a fantastic scorer, great guy to come off the bench. And overall, when you look at the team that the Knicks were able to build, or Leon was able to build with help from other people within the organization, in just one season, they had a really good team. Now, of course, all the younger players that they were drafting and getting were from multiple seasons, but basically he made a huge change from the first season in that 2019 season where the Knicks were terrible to his first full season with the Knicks in 2020 where he completely made the Knicks a really good team. And all this talent was tied together with hiring head coach Tom Thibodeau, who was seen very early on to be the perfect choice for the Knicks. Now, if you have a ton of talent on your roster, you can get away with not picking a great coach for your team. That's not as important if you have like 3 superstars like the Brooklyn Nets do or something crazy like that. But specifically when you're talking about most NBA teams, but specifically a team like the Knicks who are extremely young, hiring a great coach like Thibodeau is absolutely crucial for their success. All the experience that Thibodeau has had in coaching over the years really turned him into a really good head coach in my opinion, and he really has so much knowledge to teach all these young players and just improve their games individually as well as improve them as a collective unit. And overall, Thibodeau with the Knicks is just a perfect matching. And after a fantastic season for the Knicks last year, making it all the way to the 4th seed in the Eastern Conference, going into that first playoff matchup, actually a lot of people expected the Knicks to win that series against the Hawks, but it was clear very early on that the Hawks just had more talent and they were just a better team overall, and unfortunately for the Knicks, they lost in 5 games in a gentleman's sweep. And although the season didn't end the way the Knicks would have liked to, obviously they would have liked to at the very least win that series and maybe see what they can do from there, it was still a very successful season for the Knicks because not only did the Knicks have a great regular season and make it very high in the Eastern Conference and make it to the playoffs for the first time since 2013, but the way the Knicks were actually doing this was the right way. They were finally going through a youth movement, building through the draft, and making the playoffs and just getting better each and every season from the younger players that they drafted. And they didn't have to go in the offseason and look for an older NBA star that they could sign and maybe make the playoffs one season and have one good year. And after that, that player would just get too old and it would be over anyway. The Knicks were finally moving in the right direction, and there was excitement around the Knicks going into that next season. And going into this season during the offseason, the Knicks truly improved their roster. They brought in a guy in Kemba Walker to replace Elfrid Payton, which was the biggest upgrade you could possibly have. Elfrid Payton was a guy who really held the Knicks back last season due to his lack of shooting and lack of effectiveness, honestly, at some times. So bringing in a guy like Kemba Walker, who's a fantastic scorer and truly can be an all-star if healthy, was a huge upgrade and just makes this Knicks team overall so much better. Also, the Knicks were able to bring in a guy in Evan Fournier, who a lot of people see as only a catch-and-shoot 3-point guy, but he can do so much more than that. Evan Fournier is a great ball handler. He can really create his own shot for himself, either crossing over into a 3-point shot, pulling up for a mid-range jump shot, even getting all the way to the basket, finishing with either hand, left or right. Overall, he's just such a versatile offensive player, and I don't think a lot of people necessarily know how good of a scorer he is. Of course, they brought in Derrick Rose towards the tail end of last season, but besides those 2 main guys in Fournier and Kemba Walker, the roster is relatively the same, which is actually a good thing for this young team going forward. Keep that continuity going forward. Now, it's very early in this Knicks season, but after 3 games, the Knicks have looked so much improved this year than they were last year. The key additions of Walker and Fournier have appeared to be great additions for them, just adding so much scoring to their starting lineup and just team in general, when that was a big concern last year, just the inability to score at times. Their defense early on has looked pretty good, although a lot of people expect it to be worse than it was last year due to the fact that they lost some great defensive players and replaced them with some guys in Kemba Walker specifically that aren't great defenders. But very early on, the Knicks defense has looked pretty good actually, and their offense certainly has gotten so much better. And I'm just very excited to see what the Knicks can do this year. And basically that's how the Knicks went from a terrible organization for basically 20-30 years to more recently over the past 4 or 5 seasons them really starting to build something in New York and truly building in the right direction. And now we're at a point where there's actually pretty high expectations for the Knicks going into this year to not only make the playoffs but actually win around and maybe see what they can do from there. And at this point the Knicks are certainly relevant. But anyways, let me know what you guys think in the comments. How do you guys think the Knicks became relevant again? But anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and if you did enjoy, please leave a like and subscribe and hit that post notification bell. It really helps me out a lot. Until the next time, peace out, guys.
Dosage. Oh yeah, I work with the medics. I'm about to get you injected. I got a couple connections so I can get you prosthetics. Hope you can't go where I'm headed.